The night begins, as all sacred disasters do, with a candle that burns too slowly for comfort and too quickly for eternity. You would think medieval priests, those self-proclaimed accountants of heavenly debts, feared demons, dragons, and the occasional heretic with too much reading under their belt. But no, their greatest terror was far simpler, far more democratic, and infinitely more punctual. It was the darkness itself, the pure, unfiltered, tax-free darkness that seeped into stone corridors like a bureaucrat seeking signatures, the kind of darkness that had no horns, no sulfur, no dramatic entrance, just a patient, dignified ability to swallow everything that dared to exist, including, of course, the fragile egos of holy men who believed their prayers came with a warranty. And so we begin here, beneath an indifferent moon, with a question that no illuminated manuscript ever answered properly. Why did the men who claimed to serve the light quake before the very absence of it? Why did priests, those defenders of salvation, eternal life, and divine customer service, tremble not at demons, but at shadows? It is a delicious contradiction, the sort that fate and philosophy adore, that the men who preached certainty were undone by the one thing that refused to negotiate, refused to explain itself, refused to be morally classified. You know, the darkness, that old, stubborn friend. The candle in front of you flickers the way truth does when someone important walks into the room. Wax slides down like a monk reconsidering his vows, and the air grows thicker, heavy with that medieval fragrance, dust, damp stone, and unwashed hope. Tonight's story moves slowly, deliberately, like a procession heading toward a revelation that may or may not show up on time. You're here not to witness action. Heavens no, that would be efficient, but to drift into the rhythm of whispered philosophy, half-forgotten hymns, and human absurdity wrapped in holy robes too long for the wearer. But listen closely. You can almost hear them now. The monks in the cloisters, convincing themselves that the night is simply a test they never quite passed, a test nobody asked for, a test whose instructions were definitely not included in Scripture. There is irony in every breath of this tale, irony in the way faith tries to explain fear, irony in how the divine is sought most fervently when it answers least frequently, irony in how men of God, champions of invisible worlds, were undone by the simplest invisibility of all. And perhaps there is a bit of irony in you too, sitting there in the dim glow of a screen, pretending you came for sleep, and not for answers that should probably come with a warning label. But before we sink deeper into this soft abyss of theology, psychology, and existential candlelight, before we follow a certain unnamed priest into the long corridor of his own unraveling, there is a small ritual we must perform, a ritual of the modern age, one the medieval monks would have misunderstood, feared, and probably condemned as witchcraft. And that, of course, is the sacred gesture of acknowledging the algorithm. So, before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing. Like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. Now breathe. Let the shadows settle. Let the irony seep in like incense into old robes. Let the story open its spine and invite you inside, gently, the way a monastery welcomes a lost traveler, mostly to keep an eye on him. The wind drags its cold fingers across the slate roofs. The bells, too tired to ring, hang like forgotten promises. Somewhere, a mouse commits the quiet sin of hunger, stealing crumbs from the altar. And in the center of this whispered medieval hush stands the truth, heavy, graceful, and a little embarrassed to be here. That darkness, real darkness, is not an enemy. It is a mirror in which the priest, the pilgrim, and the wandering soul must confront not spiritual warfare, but themselves, which, as you will see, is far more terrifying. And so our tale begins, not with a demon, not with a miracle, not with a martyrdom or a prophecy or even a scandal, though don't worry, those tend to wander in later. No, our story opens with a priest whose knees tremble at sundown, whose prayers grow suspiciously enthusiastic when the sun dips, and whose courage is stored exclusively in daylight hours. But don't judge him. You too fear what you cannot see. You too wonder what waits in the quiet. You too feel the weight of the night pressing against the fragile stained glass of your certainty. And this priest, This wonderfully human, beautifully confused priest will guide you through 12 chapters of doubt, devotion, and spiritual irony, all illuminated by nothing but the candle he swears he's not afraid to replace. So draw closer. The darkness has already arrived, and it has questions. The monastery did not rise from the earth so much as it tolerated being built upon it, the way stone occasionally tolerates human ambition. It clung to the edge of a hill that never asked for such company, wrapped in a permanent breath of mist, fog that moved with the patience of a librarian annoyed by loud souls. Every wall smelled of humility and old confessions. Every hallway echoed with the sound of sandals dragging theological uncertainty. It is here, in this fortress of holy insomnia, that our priest lived. His name, well, names are dangerous things. Once spoken, they become too real, too solid, too accountable. So we will call him the priest because he liked titles more than identities. Titles hid him, protected him, excused him. They made him feel like he belonged to something divine, even when his thoughts wandered toward deliciously unapproved territory. The world around him was not the world you know. There were no soft streetlights to keep the night at bay, no digital glow pretending to be a moon, no reassuring hum of refrigerators or passing cars. No, night in the medieval world arrived with the confidence of a sovereign whose power required no introduction. When darkness came, it swallowed the sky whole. Even the stars, those pinpricks of cosmic gossip, seemed reluctant to shine too brightly for fear of drawing attention from things better left unnamed. The priest lived in a small stone chamber no larger than the spiritual progress he felt safe attempting. The room contained a bed of wood that creaked like an old sinner, a desk covered in parchment, and a single window too narrow for escape, but wide enough to let in cold doubts. The air always smelled of ink, candle smoke, and the faint despair of unfinished psalms. His daily routine was an elegant masterpiece of spiritual autopilot. He woke before dawn because everyone else did. He prayed because it was printed in the schedule. He fasted because eating too much bread was apparently threatening to salvation in ways Scripture never elaborated on. He swept the cloister floors with the enthusiasm of a man sweeping away existential dread. And he did all of it with the serene expression of someone who absolutely, unquestionably believed, or at least pretended so thoroughly, that the universe might eventually give him extra credit. When he prayed, he did so with a posture so perfect that even the statues judged him less harshly. But inside he recited words the way one repeats a familiar recipe, hoping the ingredients would miraculously taste like something divine, even though they never had before. He prayed more out of muscle memory than conviction. He bowed more out of habit than reverence. And every time he sprinkled holy water, he secretly wondered whether the well had been blessed enough, or whether he was essentially splashing sinners with regular water and wishful thinking. He wasn't a bad priest. Not at all. He was simply a deeply human one, burdened with the delicate curse of noticing things, noticing the silence after prayers, noticing the ambiguity in miracles, noticing how easily beliefs frayed when someone asked a question at the wrong time. The monks around him carried themselves like vessels of unwavering faith, though he suspected their confidence came mostly from poor lighting. A dim corridor could make anyone look enlightened if the candle was placed correctly. At meals, they spoke in hushed tones about virtues, scriptures, and the moral weaknesses of people outside the monastery. Never, of course, their own. Their humility was a performance so polished it deserved applause. Our priest observed all this with a mixture of admiration and the quiet suspicion that everyone was bluffing. The monastery bells rang constantly, as if they feared being forgotten. Their tolling echoed across stone courtyards and into the priest's skull, where it mixed comfortably with his internal commentary. He often thought the bells rang so often not to call the monks to prayer, but to keep them from falling asleep during the endless theological debates about how many metaphors a soul could survive. And then there was the night, the true ruler of this place. You have never seen darkness like medieval darkness. It was not absence, it was presence, a thick, breathing presence that crawled across the floor like a slow revelation. When the sun left, it didn't simply say goodbye. It closed the door and locked it, leaving the monks alone with their thoughts, which was arguably crueler than any demon. The priest loathed this time of day. Oh, he claimed otherwise. He claimed to love contemplation, loved silence, loved the stillness of night. He said these things with such theatrical sincerity that even the ravens outside paused their gossip to roll their eyes. But as soon as the last candle in the hallway burned low, his chest tightened in that familiar, embarrassing way. His heartbeat became a drumbeat, one far too enthusiastic for a man who preached serenity. And the darkness, that old, inevitable guest, slipped into his chamber and sat with him the way an uninvited tutor sits with a failing student. He felt watched by nothing. He felt judged by silence. He felt accompanied by absence. And if that sounds dramatic, remember, this was a man who had been trained to believe everything had a meaning. Everything. Every cough, every gust of wind, every flicker of candlelight. So imagine the psychological gymnastics when confronted with something that refused interpretation. Darkness was the only thing he couldn't preach at. It didn't negotiate. It didn't promise. It didn't threaten. It didn't answer prayers. It didn't even blink. It simply was. And that was enough to make him uneasy. Each night he wrapped himself in his wool robe, a robe that smelled faintly of incense and the terrified sweat of evening prayers, and pretended not to listen to the whispers of the wind sneaking through the window cracks. The darkness felt like an exam he hadn't studied for, a theological question that refused multiple-choice answers. But he persevered, as priests do. He lit his candle. He recited his passages. He waited for dawn, like a man waiting for a delayed savior. Sometimes, when the night stretched too long, he would whisper to himself, "It's only the absence of light," which is exactly the sort of sentence people say when trying to convince themselves of something they do not believe. The monastery around him would settle into its nocturnal chorus, distant coughs, shuffling footsteps, pages turning in sleepy devotion, and the occasional thud that every monk pretended not to hear, because acknowledging it meant confronting questions no one wanted answers to. And in this place, in this sacred, confused, beautifully human world, our priest lived a life of ritual, routine, and relentlessly polite fear. A fear he would deny with the confidence of a man who has practiced denial. For many, many years, he was not afraid of demons. Demons were dramatic, predictable, scripturally obligated to follow certain rules. No, demons were easy. But the darkness, the formless, nameless, non-negotiable darkness, that was harder to exorcise, because you cannot banish something that is older than fear itself. And he felt it, night after night, like a quiet hand on his shoulder, a reminder, a warning, a question without punctuation. His world was built on light, and darkness had begun to notice. Before doubt touched him, before it slipped between his ribs like a courteous intruder, our priest believed in faith the way people believe in good weather forecasts, optimistically, selectively, and only when convenient. He carried his beliefs the way one carries a fragile relic, carefully, reverently, and always with the secret fear that it might crumble without warning. To him, faith was less a blazing revelation and more a comfortable blanket, woven by ancestors, and maintained with the quiet hope that no one would notice its fraying edges. He had inherited a religion that smelled of old parchment and expectation. Not pressure, no, that would be honest, just expectation. That polite kind of spiritual obligation that wraps itself in tradition and calls it devotion. He believed in miracles, in the same way modern shoppers believe in supermarket discounts. You know, they probably exist. Someone else has definitely seen one. And if you squint hard enough at an oddly shaped loaf of bread, it might even look like a sign. He believed in prayer the way one believes in herbal tea, soothing, repetitive, and unlikely to do harm unless excessively consumed. He whispered his prayers into the cold monastery air, imagining each word floated upward like smoke, only to wonder, secretly, whether heaven had ever responded or simply perfected the art of divine voicemail. His relationship with faith was intimate, but avoidant, like someone who loves the idea of an arranged marriage but dreads the reality of dinner conversations. To him, God was less a being and more an atmosphere, a presence rumored to be everywhere but confirmed nowhere. His sermons, oh, those sermons, were gentle masterpieces of ambiguity. He spoke of light, hope, forgiveness, compassion, concepts so abstract that no one could accuse him of saying anything wrong. His favorite trick was theological vagueness. Ask him about the purpose of suffering, and he would close his eyes dramatically, whisper something like, Ah, suffering is the night sky in which the stars of grace can finally shine, which sounded profound until you realized it meant absolutely nothing. But people loved it, because people love anything that sounds both poetic and non-committal. He believed because everyone else believed. He doubted because he was alive. He preached because silence frightened him more than the possibility of being wrong. Inside the chapel, he often felt that faith was a performance, and he was merely following choreography, written centuries before he existed. Stand, kneel, chant, cross yourself, pretend not to think about dinner. Faith was a dance, and he had 2 left feet, but no one noticed, especially in dim candlelight. And yet, here is where the irony becomes tender. He genuinely wanted to believe, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of longing, a longing for certainty, for meaning, for someone to whisper in his ear that the universe wasn't just an elaborate joke told by a bored cosmic storyteller. He wanted faith to be simple, predictable, a clean equation. Pray plus obey. Peace. But faith, as you know, does not care for equations. Faith prefers riddles, paradoxes, questions that wake you at midnight and pretend to be revelations. And our priest, poor man, was especially vulnerable to those. During long afternoons, he sat by the stained glass windows, letting the colored light paint his face with borrowed sanctity. He loved those moments. They made him look holier than he felt, and appearances, after all, are a central sacrament of religious life. He would close his eyes and imagine the divine light filling him, yet often wondered whether he was moved by the presence of God or simply by good lighting. When the choir sang, their voices rising like fragile wings into the vaulted ceiling, he sometimes felt a swell of something spiritual. But even that could be explained away by acoustics and the emotional manipulation of well-placed harmonies. His faith was a balance between poetic yearning and intellectual suspicion, a seesaw between surrender and analysis, a candle constantly flickering between devotion and commentary. And oh, how he admired those monks who seemed unquestioningly certain, those who prayed with the fervor of men who had never doubted, even though he suspected they too sometimes looked at the sky and wondered whether the heavens were simply ignoring them. But he envied them nonetheless. He envied their peace, their unbroken belief, their spiritual confidence. What a luxury! He, on the other hand, treated faith the way someone treats a fragile heirloom. It's precious, yes, but please don't touch it too hard. At times he convinced himself he was devout. For example, whenever he successfully interpreted a vaguely shaped cloud as a sign, or when he avoided sin not out of piety, but because sinning required effort, and he was frankly too tired. He had learned to mistake spiritual convenience for spiritual truth. And perhaps, if we're being honest, you have too. But back to him. He thought of God the way one thinks of a distant monarchy, probably real, theoretically powerful, but unlikely to intervene directly unless the paperwork was extraordinary. He prayed more out of politeness than expectation, as though God were an elderly relative whose feelings he didn't want to hurt. Yet beneath all this comedy, all this charming hypocrisy, all this beautifully human confusion, he held one sincere belief, that the world was not meant to be faced alone, and so he clung to faith as one clings to a rope on a foggy night, not because it guarantees safety, but because letting go would mean admitting he could no longer see the path. His faith was fragile, yes, contradictory certainly, deeply poetic, accidentally, and sincere, in a shy, mismatched, uncertain kind of way. But still faith, still something, still a flickering light in the vast cathedral of his mind. He cherished it, not because it made sense, but because it kept him company. And it is precisely this kind of faith, quiet, brittle, secretly trembling, that breaks the most beautifully, not with violence, but with a whisper, not with thunder, but with a question, not with heresy, but with honesty. He had no idea how close he already was to the edge. Soon, something small, so small it could only be divine or ridiculous, would slip into his life and crack open the delicate shell of certainty he had spent years polishing. Something would come, something would shift, something would whisper, "Are you sure?" And that would be enough, because fragile faith doesn't require storms to break, only a breeze. The seed of doubt did not arrive with fanfare. Doubt never does. It did not come wrapped in thunder, nor in a divine whisper echoing through the vaults, nor in a demon's hiss slithering out of the shadows. No, doubt has better manners than that. It came quietly, like a polite intruder tapping on the window of the priest's mind. And the moment it arrived, it behaved exactly the way doubt always behaves. It made itself comfortable without waiting for permission. The day had been unremarkable, a drizzle of grey clouds, monks chanting in tones that suggested mild constipation, and the priest performing his duties with the elegant disinterest of a man trying very hard to seem spiritually productive while mentally rehearsing tomorrow's sermon. Hours passed in that sacred monotony, sweeping stone floors, organizing scrolls no one had read since the last plague, listening to Brother Athanasius dramatize minor sins as if auditioning for an apocalyptic choir. But everything shifted at dusk. The monastery bell rang its evening prayer call, an event usually as eventful as stale bread. The priest entered the chapel, ready to mumble the familiar chants with the enthusiasm of a man reciting a shopping list. The candles flickered. The air smelled of frankincense and theological exhaustion. He lifted his eyes toward the crucifix. Just routine, just muscle memory. And then it happened. A single drop of wax from the nearest candle slid down like a tear, slow, deliberate, unreasonably theatrical, and landed on the stone floor with a tiny hiss. Simple, unimportant, insignificant even, except it wasn't, because in the precise heartbeat after it fell, the priest felt, he would insist later, reluctantly, that the darkness in the chapel exhaled. Not a draught, not wind, slipping through the cracks. No, something breathed, something ancient, something thoughtful, something that had been listening far too long. He froze. This was, of course, ridiculous. Darkness does not breathe. Shadows do not exhale philosophically at candle tears. But the mind is a theatrical stage, and his was in the mood for drama. He swallowed, told himself he was imagining things, a classic line in every spiritual crisis, and forced his gaze back to the altar. There, on the embroidered cloth, lay the holy book, open to a passage he did not remember leaving open. Now, this could be explained logically. Another monk had moved it, or a breeze had turned the page, or divine providence was bored. But the page it had stopped on was peculiar, a verse about light and fear and the shadows between all things. The priest squinted. The letters seemed darker than usual, like ink still wet. He blinked once, twice. The text looked normal again, but a prickling feeling crept over his spine, the type one gets when realizing the universe might be reading you for a change. He closed the book quickly, too quickly. The sound echoed louder than any prayer. Brother Lucius, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. "Are you well?" Lucius asked with that serene, moral superiority monks use like perfume. "Yes," the priest lied with the confidence of a sinner caught mid-sin. "Perfectly well, perfectly faithful, perfectly unbothered by books opening themselves." Lucius nodded, unconvinced, and resumed chanting. The priest resumed pretending everything was normal, but something inside him had cracked open like a fragile reliquary. Not broken, not shattered, just open. That was enough. Later, as he walked across the courtyard, drizzle turning his robe into a heavy reminder of earthly burdens, he noticed a crow perched on the fountain. Normally, crows in monasteries were as common as doubts in sermons, but this one stared at him, directly, accusingly, philosophically. Its black eyes seemed to say, "You felt it, didn't you?" He muttered, "Go away," which is a perfectly respectable theological stance when speaking to birds. The crow tilted its head. He walked faster. The sky darkened, swallowing the last traces of sunset. The stone path gleamed with rainwater, reflecting his distorted silhouette, an elongated shadow with too many unanswered questions. When he reached his chamber, he lit his candle with trembling fingers. Not out of fear, he told himself. Oh no, not fear. He was simply cold, or wet, or alive. Yes, that was it. He was alive, which was inconvenient for any man trying to avoid inner conflict. He sat at his desk and opened his journal, the one he kept hidden below a stack of theological treatises no one opened voluntarily. His handwriting wavered as he wrote, "I felt something, a presence, or an absence pretending to be one. I do not know what it means, perhaps nothing, but the darkness tonight felt aware, observant, almost expectant. He stared at the sentence. It felt melodramatic. Then again, so did faith. He dipped his quill again, pressed it to the page and whispered, "Why would darkness breathe?" The question hung in the room like a visitor refusing to leave. Moments later, the candle flickered. Just once. Just enough. He froze again. Of course, candlelight always flickers. That is its job description. But tonight the flicker felt intentional, like a reply, like someone gently clearing their throat in the quiet. He said aloud, too loudly, "Stop that." The candle, indifferent, continued burning. He sighed, leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He told himself he was overtired, overwrought, over everything. He reminded himself that priests were not meant to entertain fantasies. And yet, doubt whispered in a voice softer than prayer, gentler than confession, and far more persuasive than any sermon. Doubt said, "What if something is watching? What if the darkness is not empty? What if the breath you felt was the world acknowledging you?" Absurd questions, dangerous questions, delicious questions. He closed the journal. He tried to pray. He tried to feel the comfort he had always associated with rituals. But the words felt hollow, like dried petals pressed between pages long forgotten. He tried again. Still nothing. The silence after prayer was louder than any answer could have been. And in that silence, the seed of doubt began to sprout, thin, pale, and persistent, a fragile vine curling through the architecture of his beliefs. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and somewhere, whether in the room or in his own mind, the darkness exhaled back. The morning after the wax tear, the breathing darkness, and the excessively judgmental crow, the priest awoke with the most ancient coping mechanism known to humankind: denial. Glorious, luminous, radiant denial. He rose from bed as if nothing had happened, quite literally willing nothing to have happened. He stretched, yawned, cracked his neck like a man preparing to forget an entire existential experience, and exhaled with theatrical confidence. It was just fatigue, he told himself, which is what every human being says before their life takes a philosophical nosedive. He opened his window shutters with exaggerated cheerfulness, letting the cold morning air slap him into the illusion of clarity. Birds chirped, bells rang, monks shuffled about, their sandals scraping stone like tired metaphors. Everything was normal, he insisted, and if the universe dared to disagree, he would simply ignore it. He walked into the cloister with a smile so forced it could have been carved by a sculptor. His fellow monks noticed immediately, because monks, despite their vows of silence, excel at reading emotional weather the way farmers read clouds. "Brother," said one monk hesitantly, "you seem cheerful." "Yes," the priest replied, beaming unnaturally. "Very cheerful. Enthusiastically so, spiritually radiant, nearly glowing with holy vigor." The monk stared at him with the polite concern one reserves for people who have clearly slept too little or experienced too many revelations. "Is something wrong?" the monk asked. "No," the priest said, his smile widening. "Everything is perfect," which, of course, is what someone says when absolutely everything is not. He went about his morning rituals with a devotion that bordered on suspicious. He sang the hymns louder than usual, loud enough that even the statues seemed to flinch. He sprinkled holy water with such enthusiasm that nearby monks subtly stepped back to avoid being baptized for the 4th time that week. During confession duty, he nodded so fervently at penitents that one elderly woman leaned forward and asked, "Are you well, Father? Your head seems very agreeable this morning." "Well, I am exceptionally well," he replied, nodding even harder, "in perfect union with divine purpose, overflowing with certainty, brimming with peace." He sounded like a man trying to convince both heaven and himself at the same time. As the hours passed, his denial only blossomed further, like a rare spiritual flower that blooms best in direct contradiction of reality. He polished the altar cups until he could see his own reflection, something he normally avoided at all costs. He swept the nave with the intense passion of a man sweeping sin itself out the door. He straightened the candles with military precision, ensuring they formed a perfect line of obedient flames. Each task was performed with the feverish dedication of someone desperately hoping that routine could overwrite revelation. But inside, beneath the smile, beneath the polished rituals, beneath the layers of forced serenity, the question gnawed. What did I feel last night? Which is why he worked harder. Which is why he prayed louder. Which is why he refused to sit still long enough for thought to catch up. He believed, foolishly, that if he behaved wholly enough, the universe would forget the previous night's conversation. At midday meal, he sat straighter than usual, spooned stew into his bowl with reverent precision, and recited the blessing with the solemnity of a man negotiating peace with heaven. Brother Lucius sat across from him, watching. "You seem energetic today," Lucius observed. "Do I?" the priest said brightly. "Yes, unsettlingly so, like a man who is either very inspired or very nervous." "I assure you," the priest replied, "I am inspired." Lucius tilted his head. "Inspired by what?" The priest hesitated one heartbeat too long. "By faith," he finally said. "Ah, yes, faith, the universal answer, the perfect shield, the metaphysical umbrella under which all human confusion seeks shelter." Lucius smiled politely, but his eyes remained sharp. Monks, as it turns out, are natural predators of spiritual nonsense. "Good," Lucius said, slowly. "Very good, though it is curious. Inspired men usually whisper their prayers, not shout them loud enough to frighten the choir novices." The priest stabbed a piece of carrot with unnecessary force. "I am merely enthusiastic," he said through gritted teeth. Lucius nodded, unconvinced, yet gracious. The priest continued eating, his spoon trembling only slightly. When afternoon prayers came, he doubled down on his denial. If his faith had been a candle before, now it was a bonfire built out of sheer stubbornness. He knelt so hard his knees would be bruised for days. He folded his hands so tightly they ached. He prayed with such intensity that the monk beside him subtly inched away, perhaps concerned about spontaneous combustion. "If I just believe harder," he thought, "the doubt will leave," which is the spiritual equivalent of saying, "If I smile wide enough, the universe won't notice the panic in my eyes." He recited litanies with passion, sang psalms with vigor, medicated his mind with rituals. But even as he prayed, something felt off. His voice sounded too loud in his own skull. His heart beat too fast. His thoughts were not aligned, but scrambled, panicked, rearranged like pages of a book dropped on the floor. And worst of all, every time he closed his eyes, he saw the candle from last night, the wax tear, the exhale, that moment of awareness. He shook his head to banish it, but the memory remained. He stood from prayer so abruptly that several monks turned to look, startled. "I need air," he declared. "Air. Yes, air solves everything." He walked quickly to the courtyard, his robes swishing like irritated wind. The sky was overcast. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint promise of rain. He breathed deeply, then again, then again. But the doubt did not dissolve. It clung to him, subtle and persistent. He paced the courtyard like a man wrestling invisible questions, which, technically, he was. He muttered reassurances under his breath. It was nothing, nothing, nothing at all. But doubt is not defeated by repetition. It is strengthened by it. As he walked back toward his chamber, he made a decision, a bold, brilliantly naive decision. He would simply act even more faithful. He would drown doubt in devotion. He would bury uncertainty beneath rituals. He would stack prayers like bricks, building a wall between him and whatever he had felt last night. He entered his chamber and immediately began rearranging the space as if God were coming for a surprise inspection. He straightened scrolls, dusted shelves, fluffed his straw pillow, tightened the knots of his robe, and lit not one, not two, but 6 candles around the room, because nothing says confidence like excessive illumination. The flames flickered gently. He stared at them, breathing slowly, convinced he was now safe, protected, insulated from the darkness. But then, one candle flickered again, just a little, just enough, and he felt it, that same subtle awareness, that same sense of being noticed, that same soft whisper of presence. He forced a smile. "Nothing," he whispered. "Just the air, just the draft, just Nothing. But denial, magnificent as it is, has its limits. And in that quiet room, surrounded by trembling candlelight, the priest felt for the first time what all faithful people eventually feel when truth and belief collide. The frightening, liberating, inconvenient realization that pretending does not stop the universe from paying attention. Not even a little. The universe, when it decides to communicate, rarely does so with clarity. It prefers riddles. It prefers metaphors. It prefers to send signals so ambiguous that even angels must sigh and say, "Really? That's the message." And so the priest, in the days that followed his brilliant denial campaign, found himself stalked by signs. Small ones, trivial ones, absurd ones. Not enough to be revelations. Not enough to ignore. Perfectly engineered to drive a spiritually fragile man exquisitely mad. It began innocently enough, with bread. At breakfast, the monks tore into the daily loaf, dense, flavorless, penitential bread that tasted like regret made edible. The priest reached for a piece, tore it apart, and froze. The burn mark on the crust resembled a face, a saintly face, or a scowling baker, or possibly a potato. It was unclear. He stared at it, entranced. Brother Lucius, noticing, leaned over and whispered, "Do you see something?" "No," the priest lied immediately. "Just bread." Lucius nodded, but his lips twitched with amusement. The priest placed the bread down and pretended not to see its expression turning more judgmental by the second. Later that morning, he walked through the scriptorium, a quiet chamber where monks copied holy texts by candlelight, turning mistakes into theological controversies for future generations. The room was filled with the gentle scratching of quills and the soft groans of men who were definitely losing their eyesight. As he passed a desk, he noticed a scrap of parchment lying on the floor, a single line of ink, a phrase, a sentence. He stooped to pick it up, expecting a copying error, perhaps a misplaced comma causing the monk to enter an existential spiral. But the writing said, "The darkness sees you." He stared, blood draining from his face. He looked around. No monk seemed responsible. No one looked up. No one watched him. He swallowed. Then, very rationally, he folded the parchment into a tiny square and shoved it into his sleeve like a man hiding evidence from divine authorities. "It's just a note," he muttered. "A fragment. A coincidence. A draft." But that night, when he returned to his chamber and unfolded it again, the ink had changed. Hadn't it? No, surely not. Ink does not rewrite itself. Parchment does not update like celestial software. And yet, the sentence now read, "You see it too." He dropped the parchment. Immediately, it fluttered to the floor with the gentle insult of a feather refusing to apologize. He backed away. He stepped on his rug. The rug, which had been perfectly straight for years, was now slightly askew. Normally, this meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. But tonight? Oh, tonight it meant doom. He knelt down, trembling, and fixed it with the urgency of a man re-establishing control over the only part of the universe still predictable. "There," he whispered. "Order." But the moment he stood, the rug curled at one corner. Just a little. Just enough to be disrespectful. He knelt again, fixed it again, stood. The corner lifted again. He stared at it, breath shallow. "Stop," he said softly. The rug said nothing, but its silence was definitely mocking. He straightened it a third time, slowly, deliberately, with all the dignity of a man trying to spiritually dominate flooring. Finally satisfied, he backed away, only for the candle on his desk to gutter violently, sending a tiny burst of sparks into the air like applause. "No," he whispered, "not tonight." He turned away, deciding very wisely to ignore both rugs and candles. But the universe was not done. When he finally laid down, pulling his wool blanket over his shoulders, he heard a noise, a soft thump, then another, then another. He sat up, heart pounding. The sound came from the corner of the room, near the old wooden chest where he kept nothing but winter robes and abandoned hopes. He lit his candle slowly. The sound stopped. He waited. Silence. He exhaled. Then, thump. He nearly threw the candle. He approached the chest with the cautious optimism of a man approaching spiritual disaster, lifted the lid, and found nothing, just fabric. Just robes. Just emptiness. He let out a shaky breath, convincing himself the noise had been the wood settling. Wood loved to settle in old monasteries. It did so constantly, dramatically, loudly, like the elderly monks it lived with. But as he lowered the lid, the chest whispered, very quietly, almost kindly, a soft, breath-like sound. His hand froze. "No," he whispered. "No, absolutely not." He backed away like a man trying not to startle destiny. The signs continued. The next morning, as he crossed the cloister, he passed by the well. Normally the well said nothing. It minded its own business, as any respectable well should. But today its water reflected not the sky, not his face, but the chapel's interior. An impossible angle, a wrong angle, an angle that defied both physics and theology. He leaned over, eyes wide, blinking. The reflection shifted, darkened. For a heartbeat, he saw a silhouette standing behind him in the water. He spun around. No one. He leaned over again. The water now showed nothing but his own bewildered expression. He stepped back, trembling. "Coincidences," he whispered. "All coincidences." But the universe, mischievous as ever, added one more. A final sign. That evening, while passing through a hallway lit only by pale torchlight, he saw a shadow on the wall. Perfectly still, perfectly shaped, perfectly wrong. It was shaped like a man, but not like him. Taller, thinner, head bowed as if listening. He froze. The shadow did not move. He stepped closer. The shadow did not move. He touched the wall with trembling fingers. The shadow shifted. It turned its head, just slightly, just enough. He stumbled back, heart hammering in his throat. When he blinked, the shadow was gone. Gone completely, as if it had never been there, as if it had simply stepped out of existence the moment he acknowledged it. He stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by torches whispering smoke into the air. His breath trembled in the cold silence. These were not signs of enlightenment, not signs of prophecy, not signs of divine guidance. These were the kind of signs the universe sends when it wants to say, "I'm here, but I refuse to explain anything." And that, truly, is the most spiritually destabilizing message of all. It is one thing to ignore a sign. It is another to ignore many signs. But it is a heroic level of spiritual stubbornness to ignore all signs, especially when they begin following you around the monastery like particularly clingy metaphors. And yet the priest tried. Oh, how he tried. For several days he insisted nothing unusual was happening, despite absolutely everything happening. He walked faster, spoke shorter, prayed louder, and blinked more often than any spiritually stable man should. But denial, like cheap candles, burns out quickly. And on the fifth night, the descent began. The night had arrived early, greedy and heavy. The sky looked less like a sky and more like the lid of a cosmic coffin. A cold draught slithered through the stone corridors, brushing the edges of torches until their flames wavered like frightened servants. The priest was in the chapel, performing the most desperate, universal ritual humans know, cleaning things in order to avoid feelings. He wiped dust from the altar, polished the brass candlesticks, rearranged hymn scrolls alphabetically, a questionable theological innovation, and even tried brushing soot off the stone sculptures, as if meaningful clarity could be achieved by shining something old. He hummed hymns, then hummed them faster, then louder, then with a shaky vibrato that suggested emotional collapse disguised as devotional enthusiasm. Brother Lucius eventually emerged from the shadows like a judgmental apparition. "Brother," he said gently, "it is nearly midnight." The priest didn't stop polishing the candlestick. "It is," he replied cheerfully. "Yes," Lucius continued, "and you have been cleaning that same candlestick for nearly an hour." The priest froze. Then slowly he set the candlestick down. "Oh," he said. Lucius stepped closer, studying him with the compassionate suspicion of a monk who has seen many a soul wander too close to theological cliffs. "You seem troubled." "I am not troubled," the priest said instantly, too instantly. "Of course," Lucius murmured. "Then why are you shaking?" The priest looked at his hands. They trembled like candle flames in a jealous wind. He hid them behind his robe. "I am simply cold." "It is not cold," Lucius replied calmly. "It might be." the priest insisted. Lucius exhaled, his breath carrying years of trained patience. "Brother, if something weighs on your spirit, you may share it." The priest opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, said nothing. Lucius nodded, almost sadly. "Then may peace come to you despite yourself." And he walked away. The priest watched him leave, feeling a mixture of relief and the devastating sense that someone had just offered him a rope, and he, in classic spiritual fashion, chose to drown politely instead. When he was alone again, he extinguished the candles one by one, plunging the chapel into soft, breathless darkness. And then the crisis began. It started with a sound, not loud, not startling, soft, like something brushing against the edge of existence, a subtle shiver of air near the altar, almost like a sigh. He stood very still. The darkness around him was thick, velvety, slow. It clung to the corners of the chapel like ancient moss. He squinted, trying to distinguish shape from shadow. Then came another sound, a faint scrape, stone against stone, like a footstep, but not quite. His breath hitched. "No," he whispered to himself. "No, absolutely not. We're not doing this." He turned toward the exit, determined to leave, to escape, to outrun whatever his imagination, or the universe, had chosen to reveal tonight. But halfway to the door he heard it again, a whisper, soft, low, like cloth brushing over stone. He spun around. Nothing, just the chapel, silent, still, sacred in all the wrong ways. His heart thundered in his chest, pumping fear into every corner of his body with admirable efficiency. He took a step backward. Then the door behind him creaked. He jumped, whirled around. Nothing again. The chapel door was still closed, but the silence after the creak felt alive. He backed away slowly, hands trembling. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength." But what came instead was another sound, a murmur, indistinct, like two voices arguing in a language older than Scripture. He felt the hairs on his neck rise one by one, as if the air had fingers brushing upward through them. He wasn't imagining it now. He couldn't be. Something was in the chapel with him. Not a person, not an animal, not a demon. Those were noisy, dramatic creatures with a flair for theatrics and sulphur. This presence was quiet, patient, observing him with the serene curiosity of shadows, studying a candle. He swallowed hard. "Who's there?" he called, knowing full well no sane answer could follow. The silence deepened, thickened, wrapped around the room like an invisible cloak. He stepped backward again until his back met the stone wall. He pressed against it, grounding himself in the cold solidity of something that definitely existed. The presence did not approach. It simply remained, waiting, watching, breathing. He felt it, not in his ears, not in his eyes, but in his bones. A pressure, a vibration, a subtle hum that threaded itself through the dark like a low note played on a distant organ. His thoughts began spiraling, rapid and wild. What if the darkness was alive? What if the signs were warnings? What if faith had been a conversation and he hadn't been listening? His breath became faster, shallower. "No," he whispered. "I am imagining things. I am tired. I am—" But then the candles, those he had extinguished, flickered. Not lit, not relit, just flickered, as if something had passed in front of them, something tall, something moving without shape. His knees buckled. He slumped to the floor. He clutched his robe like a lifeline. His mind raced through every prayer he'd ever learned, each one suddenly evaporating from memory like unhelpful smoke. He grasped at words, symbols, chants, anything. But each fragment dissolved before it could form. It was the moment every human fears, the moment when beliefs do not protect you, when rituals do not shield you, when certainty fails its final exam. He pressed his palms against his face, trembling, sweat cold on his brow. "Please," he whispered, "whatever you are, please." But the presence still did not move. It simply existed, solid, silent, certain, and the priest realized, slowly, painfully, that the worst part was not the fear. It was the familiarity. Something about the presence felt known, not friendly, not safe, just known, like a truth he had ignored finally stepping into the room. He lifted his head, breath shaky. The darkness seemed to lean closer. He felt it hovering at the edge of sight, the edge of mind, the edge of everything he'd ever confidently preached. His voice cracked as he whispered, "What do you want from me?" A long pause. The air shifted, and the presence, the vast, patient, quiet presence, seemed to whisper back in a soundless voice, "To be seen." The priest stared into the darkness, terrified, because in that moment he understood something profoundly inconvenient. He had feared demons all his life, but darkness was far more intimate, far more ancient, far more honest, and it was done being ignored. The breaking point is never loud. People imagine it as thunder, dramatic, cathartic, illuminated by divine lightning. But no, the true collapse of a soul happens the way old parchment tears, quietly, reluctantly, with the soft sigh of something that has held itself together far too long. For the priest, it began with the simplest sensation. He could not breathe, not because the room lacked air, but because the air itself felt sentient, alive, watching him with the patient curiosity of a librarian observing a particularly confused patron. He pressed his back against the chapel wall, trembling. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, those sharp little inhales that sound like someone arguing with their own lungs. The darkness around him pulsed, not brightening, not dimming, just pulsing, like a heart beating in slow, cosmic rhythm. He whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for normalcy, for routine, for the universe to stop being poetic and return to being boring. But the words failed him. Every syllable slipped away the moment he reached for it, like water running through fingers too desperate to hold it. He clawed at memory. Our Father. No, that wasn't working. Hail Mary. Nothing. He tried the simplest prayer of all, the one whispered by all souls at the edge of terror. Please. And the darkness answered. Not with words, not with sound, with presence, a thickening of the air, a shift in temperature, a whisper of awareness brushing his cheek like a cold fingertip. The priest whimpered, an embarrassing sound, tragically human, the type of sound one makes only when dignity has left the building. He squeezed his eyes shut. Go away, he whispered. The darkness did not go away. In fact, it leaned closer. He felt it, not like a thing moving toward him, but like a place expanding to include him, a vastness opening, a void making room. He opened his eyes, and something changed. The chapel was no longer a chapel. The walls dissolved. The candles vanished. The stone floor beneath him melted into shadow. He found himself standing, floating, in a space that looked like night folded into itself, an endless plain of dim luminance, where the darkness was not empty, but textured, velvety, layered like a secret whispered through centuries. He gasped. He stepped back, but there was no back to step into, only more darkness, infinite, patient, observant. He was not afraid now. No, fear had become too small. He was unmoored, unhinged, unstructured, stripped of the safe little definitions he had carried since childhood. His voice echoed within the vastness, thin and shaking. Am I dead? Silence. Then, absurdly, beautifully, a soft chuckle. Not cruel, not mocking, just amused, as if the void itself found the question adorable. No, came a voice. Not a sound, but a thought pressed gently into his mind. Not dead, not dreaming. A pause, just paying attention for once. The priest's vision blurred. His knees buckled. He fell, not downward, but inward, into the overwhelming intimacy of being perceived by something that had always been there, patient as a shadow sitting beside a cradle. He managed to whisper, Who, what, are you? The presence answered with a sigh that felt like a warm wind and freezing water at the same time. Darkness. The priest trembled. But darkness is nothing, he managed. A soft ripple moved through the void, like laughter restrained out of politeness. Nothing? The presence murmured. Oh no, little priest. Nothing is far more complicated than you think. He felt the words inside his bones. Light, the presence continued, is loud. Light insists. Light declares. Light demands interpretation. Light tells stories. Another pulse of shadow, gentle, reverent. Darkness listens. Darkness waits. Darkness keeps everything that light forgets. The priest swallowed hard. Why me? Another soft, almost affectionate wave. You noticed me. His breath caught. The presence expanded, not threateningly, but like a teacher stepping closer to a frightened student. In all your chanting, it said, in all your rituals, your sermons, your borrowed certainties, you never listened. He shook his head in denial. That's not true, he whispered. The darkness hummed. Isn't it? You prayed for answers. You prayed for miracles. You prayed for signs, but you never prayed for understanding. He felt the truth strike him like a stone dropped into still water. He had prayed for comfort, for clarity, for stability, but never for truth, because truth was inconvenient. Truth was sharp. Truth asked questions that theology often avoided. He trembled. The presence leaned closer. Shall I show you? It asked. Shall I show you what you have feared? Before he could refuse, before he could nod, the darkness unfolded. Not violently, not dramatically, elegantly, the way night lifts its veil to reveal the stars. In an instant he saw it. The truth, not a divine being, not a demon, not a revelation carved in fire, but himself. Thousands, no, millions, of versions of himself, flickering like candle flames across the infinite shadow, each one holding a different fear, each one clutching a different belief, each one shaped by choices he almost made, regrets he ignored, truths he refused. He saw himself preaching with confidence he did not feel. He saw himself praying without listening. He saw himself fearing the night because he feared introspection. He saw himself worshipping routine, not divinity. He collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed. The darkness hovered near, tender as a lullaby. You fear me, it said, because I reflect you. He sobbed, quietly, shamefully, beautifully human. Why show me this? He whispered. The presence answered, because nothing is more spiritual than a failure. A laugh, dry, cracked, half-crazed, escaped his throat. It was the single most honest sound he had ever made. The darkness pressed closer. You feared I was a demon, it said. You feared I was death. You feared I was judgment. A long, soft pause. But I am simply the place where truth hides when you refuse to see it in the light. He bowed his head. And what do you want from me? He whispered. The darkness exhaled. Nothing. The word echoed through him like a liberation and a sentence. I want nothing, the presence said. I ask for nothing. I come for nothing. I offer nothing. The priest shuddered. But you show me. Everything. Yes, the darkness whispered. That is my curse. And your salvation. The presence softened. But you must choose, it said. Choose what? He whispered. A long breath. Whether to keep pretending the light answers you, or to finally hear the silence. He lifted his head, and for the first time in his life, he understood. Silence was not emptiness. Silence was conversation. Silence was truth. He exhaled a long, trembling breath, the kind a soul makes when it realizes it has just broken, beautifully. The presence withdrew slightly, like a parent giving space. The chapel slowly reformed around him. Walls, candles, stone, altar, materializing like a fragile dream returning to duty. He sat on the floor, heart racing, robes damp with sweat, eyes burning with understanding he did not ask for, but now could not unsee. The darkness lingered one last moment, a gentle farewell, a whisper inside his mind, now we begin. And then, silence. True, sacred, terrifying silence. The kind that changes everything. The silence that followed was not normal silence. Not the gentle kind that lives between breaths, nor the polite kind found in libraries. This was cathedral silence, the kind that grows moss on the walls of the soul. Our priest remained seated on the chapel floor long after the darkness had withdrawn, long after the vision, or delusion, or revelation, or psychological incident, take your pick, dissolved back into the trembling candlelight. His breathing slowed until even that felt like a disturbance. He stared at the altar. It looked the same, and yet it didn't. The candles were steady. The stone was cold. The crucifix hung with its usual carved expression of eternal disappointment. Nothing had changed, except him. He felt hollow, not in the tragic way of a broken heart, but in the uncomfortable way of a room that has been cleaned too thoroughly. His thoughts echoed inside him, bouncing off bare mental walls, stripped of the furniture of certainty. He whispered, "What now?" The chapel did not answer. Of course it didn't. Chapels never answer the first time. They're worse than bureaucracy. He ran a trembling hand across the floor. The stone was solid, reassuring, practical, qualities he suddenly found suspicious. How could anything feel stable when his mind felt like parchment soaked in water? He stood slowly. Every movement felt fragile, as though he might crack. He approached the altar, not to pray. He didn't dare attempt a prayer yet. Prayer felt too much like pretending to understand something he clearly didn't. Instead, he touched the edge of the cloth draped over the altar. He expected it to feel different, holier, heavier, charged with cosmic significance. It felt like fabric, plain fabric. He let out a soft laugh, thin, breathy, sad, the kind of laugh a person makes after realizing their life has been a series of misunderstandings performed with great enthusiasm. He needed air. He staggered out of the chapel into the courtyard. The night was still, windless, vast. Torches flickered lazily against the walls. Clouds drifted across the moon like slow, thoughtful thoughts. He inhaled, the cold air grounding him, but even the wind felt different now, quieter, more intimate, as if everything around him had been turned down in volume so that the universe could hear him think. He walked slowly across the courtyard stones, each step echoing in a chamber far deeper than his skull. The fountain in the center dripped rhythmically, tiny droplets tapping out the world's oldest lullaby. He paused to watch the water. It reflected the sky perfectly, calmly, innocently. No strange visions, no silhouettes, just water. He exhaled in relief, then frowned, because the relief felt wrong, too shallow, too temporary. He leaned over, studying his reflection. It stared back, hollow-eyed, pale, disoriented. He wondered if this was what saints looked like after enlightenment, confused, sleep-deprived, and deeply unimpressed. He touched the water's surface. Ripples distorted his face, stretching it into a grotesque caricature, his features melting into something both comic and tragic. He muttered, "Perfect." He sat beside the fountain, elbows on his knees, fingers pressed to his temples. He didn't understand. Was the darkness real? Was it symbolic? Was it a hallucination brought on by stress, fear, faith, fasting, or the suspiciously stale bread they'd served at supper? He cursed the ambiguity of existence. Would clarity be too much to ask? He whispered. The universe famously offered no comment. He rubbed his face. He felt drained, not physically, spiritually, emotionally, philosophically, existentially, and any other adverb ending in ally. But oddly, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a strange calm, a quiet that didn't feel empty, but expectant, a stillness that felt not like absence but presence, a sense, irrational, persistent, that someone was still listening, not watching, not judging, just listening. He looked up at the sky. Clouds parted slightly, revealing a thin sliver of moonlight. The moon hung there, pale and exhausted, as if it too had seen one revelation too many tonight. The priest whispered, half to himself, half to whatever cosmic entity was still tuning in, "You reveal everything, and then you leave me with silence." A breeze brushed his cheek, almost playful, almost apologetic. He closed his eyes. The silence grew softer, less oppressive, more contemplative. It wrapped around him gently, like an old blanket that had heard too many confessions. In that silence, memories flickered. His childhood, his early faith, his first sermons, his certainty, his arrogance, his hope, his confusion. All of it appeared like faint constellations in the messy night sky of his mind. And he realized something deeply ironic. He missed being ignorant. Ignorance had been comfortable, warm, simple, predictable. Revelations were none of those things. Revelations, he now understood, were like shadows. You never asked for them, and yet they insisted on appearing whenever a light finally shined where it wasn't supposed to. He lifted a handful of water from the fountain and let it fall through his fingers. The droplets sparkled briefly in the moonlight, then vanished. He whispered, "So be it." He didn't know what he meant, but it felt right. The silence settled. Not peaceful, not hostile, just there, a companion, a witness, a reminder that something had changed irrevocably, and that change, like darkness, required no explanation. Finally he stood. His legs felt steady again, his breath even, his mind quieter. He walked back toward his chamber, moving slowly, as if each step required renegotiating his place in the universe. At his door, he paused, looked back at the courtyard, at the fountain, the sky, the shadows. Everything seemed different, or maybe he was just seeing it without the old filters. He whispered into the night, "If this is faith, you could have said so earlier." The silence, in its eternal irony, refused to reply. He entered his room, closed the door gently, lit a single candle. The flame glowed softly, casting long shadows. He didn't flinch. Not this time. Instead, he sat at his desk, opened his journal and wrote with steady hands. "Something has changed. I am afraid, yes, but also alive in a way I cannot explain. The silence is terrifying. The silence is beautiful. The silence is honest." He set down the quill, looked at the candle, and whispered, "I hear you." The flame swayed gently, and the silence finally felt like a friend. The night after, the silence was different. Different in a way that felt subtle to the world, but seismic within him. He lay on his straw mattress, staring at the ceiling beams, each one dark, old and slightly bent, like retired scholars who now only observe life with mild disapproval. His candle burned low, its flame thin and weary, like a monk forced to attend one more evening sermon he didn't ask for. The shadows on the walls stretched long and soft, breathing with the rhythm of the flickering light. He felt calm. Not safe, never safe again, but calm in the way someone feels after crying without quite knowing why. He exhaled. Then something shifted. Not the air, not the sound. Something internal. It felt like the mind's version of turning a page without reading the previous paragraph. A strange, quiet expectation bloomed in him. He sat up slowly, sensing, not hearing, not seeing, just sensing that something was about to happen, or nothing, perhaps absolutely nothing, which, given the week he was having, might actually be something. He stood, wrapped his robe around himself, and stepped outside into the hallway. The monastery was asleep, deeply asleep, snoring as a form of holiness, asleep. He lit a small taper from his candle and walked, barefoot, across cold stone floors. The silence followed him, not oppressive now, curious, like a child watching its parent attempt something complicated. He reached the courtyard. The fountain shimmered with moonlight. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Everything looked painfully normal. He sighed with relief and disappointment. He sat on the edge of the fountain, dipping his fingers into the water. It was cold, cleaner tonight, almost metallic on his skin. He whispered to the sky, "Are you there?" He didn't specify who "you" was, which was precisely the point. Prayer had always demanded an addressee. Tonight the addressee was possibility. The wind shifted. A faint breeze brushed his cheek. Barely there. Barely nothing. Barely everything. He closed his eyes. And in that moment, that thin, fragile moment between breath and thought, he felt something behind him. A presence. Not the vast, overwhelming darkness from before. No, this was smaller, gentler, almost shy. He didn't move, didn't turn, didn't breathe. He simply listened. At first there was nothing. Then, a whisper, soft, low, uncertain, like someone trying to speak after centuries of silence. He felt his entire spine stiffen. The whisper came again, this time clearer, though still indecipherable. A sound without language, a meaning without words, a truth without explanation. He opened his eyes. The courtyard looked the same, but the air around him shimmered, just slightly, like heat rising from stones after a long summer day. He whispered, "Please, speak." The presence shifted. A warm tingle crawled down his spine. Then, a voice, very faint, like a thought that had wandered too close to the edge of his mind. Not male, not female, not human. A voice shaped from stillness. A voice that said, "You already know." He froze. His breath caught. "What do I know?" he whispered. No answer, just a soft movement of air behind him. He turned slowly and saw nothing, just darkness, but not empty darkness. Darkness with shape, with texture, with edges, like a figure standing just out of sight. He blinked, and it vanished. He rubbed his eyes, shaking. "Hunger," he whispered. "It must be hunger." He hadn't eaten much the past few days. Monastic diets tended to blur the line between fasting and poor culinary skill. But as soon as he spoke the word hunger, the wind stirred again. Not cold, warm, almost affectionate. He felt a pressure, gentle, on his shoulder. Not weight, not touch. Something softer, something like a promise. He looked down at the water. His reflection rippled, and in the ripple, for a single heartbeat, he saw a figure behind him, a silhouette, tall, calm, still, its head bowed, not in threat, in understanding. He gasped and turned again. Nothing, just shadows, just night, just silence. But silence had never looked so full. He staggered, back, gripping the edge of the fountain. "What do you want from me?" he whispered again. A pause, a long, deliberate silence. Then, to be understood. He felt heat rise in his chest. Frustration, fear, relief, recognition. "Understood?" he repeated. "How can I understand? Whatever you are." A whisper drifted like smoke. "You listen now." He swallowed. The wind fell still. Everything settled. He waited, longer than he expected. Seconds, minutes, a small eternity. Finally, the presence spoke again. "You feared the night, because it reflected your mind." A pause. "Now you have seen your mind." He bowed his head, ashamed, and yet oddly grateful. "I don't know what you are," he whispered. The voice responded, "Neither do I." He stared into the darkness, confused, startled, offended, existentially amused. "How can you not know?" he asked. Another whisper, "Names are for the light." He shuddered, because it made sense, more sense than anything else had in years. He closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he felt something like communion. Not the bread and wine kind, the raw kind, the kind that happens when two uncertainties recognize each other. Then, a shift, a release, a quiet departure. The presence faded, not gone, just elsewhere. He whispered, "Will you return?" The silence that followed was neither yes nor no. It was simply silence, ambiguous, enigmatic, wise, annoying. He smiled, a real smile this time, because he understood. Sometimes the divine speaks clearly. Sometimes the divine whispers. Sometimes the divine plays hide-and-seek at midnight. And sometimes the divine simply leaves you with a question that changes you. He stood slowly, breath steady, mind trembling but awake. He whispered into the night, "Thank you." A breeze answered. Or maybe it was nothing. Or maybe nothing was the answer. Morning arrived in the most disrespectful way possible. Bright, clear, unbothered, completely indifferent to the existential crisis that had unfolded just hours earlier. The sun spilled over the monastery walls like a guest who lets himself in without knocking. Its light filled the courtyard, the cloisters, the chapel, the hallways, all those places that the night had whispered into. And the priest? He stood in the doorway of his chamber, eyes half open, looking at daylight with the wary suspicion of someone encountering an old acquaintance they no longer fully trust. The sunlit world felt wrong, too simple, too honest, too everything is normal for someone who had just conversed, if that was the word, with the philosophical embodiment of the cosmos's emotional understudy. Birds chirped, monks bustled. Brother Lucius lectured a novice on broom etiquette. Life went on with the confident stupidity of a world unaware that one of its inhabitants had had his worldview cracked open like an egg dropped onto cathedral stone. The priest stepped out into the courtyard. Everything gleamed beneath the morning light. Too much. It felt like the world had turned the brightness up without his consent. He rubbed his eyes, trying to adjust, not to the light, but to existence, because something inside him was still vibrating, quietly, like a chord struck during the night that had not yet stopped trembling. He walked slowly across the courtyard, observing everything with the unsettling clarity of someone who had undergone a spiritual earthquake only to discover the building still stood. A monk greeted him. He nodded back, politely, automatically, hollowly. He felt as though a secret had been carved into him, a secret he both understood and didn't, a secret that felt warm in his chest and cold in his bones, a secret that had not been invited but now refused to leave. He passed the chapel. Its doors were open. Sunlight poured inside. The altar gleamed innocently. He paused. For a moment he considered going in, kneeling, praying, pretending the universe was still conducted by predictable liturgy. But his feet would not move. A breeze brushed past him, gentle as a reminder. Not yet, it seemed to say. Not today. He walked on. At the far end of the courtyard, the old fig tree stood, bent and proud, despite centuries of being ignored by spiritual architecture. Its leaves trembled in the morning wind, whispering secrets older than scripture. He sat beneath it. He felt the bark against his back, rough and grounding. He closed his eyes. Silence, not the divine kind, but the human kind, settled around him like dust. A small, strange thought entered his mind. What if nothing changes? What if he wakes tomorrow the same? What if the presence never returns? What if the universe gave him one taste of truth and then walked away forever, like a celestial lover with commitment issues? He hated the thought. He loved the thought. He feared the thought. He whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" The wind didn't answer. Birds didn't answer. The fig tree, ancient and unimpressed, certainly didn't answer. He rested his head back, letting sunlight warm his face. It felt different now, less comforting, more revealing, as if light and darkness were no longer opposites, but two complicated co-workers forced to share the same office. His mind wandered back to the presence from the night before, its ambiguity, its gentleness, its terrifying honesty, its refusal to give him a name or a role or instructions. Humans crave clarity. The divine craves mystery. Somewhere in between he now floated, quiet, tired, and annoyingly awake. He opened his journal, which he had brought instinctively. Blank page, white as morning, as blinding as revelation. He hesitated, then wrote, "The world looks the same today, but I do not. I think the darkness has not left. I think it walks behind me now. Quiet, patient, waiting." He paused. A drop of ink fell, creating a small blot that looked vaguely like a shadow stretching forward. He smudged it with his thumb, and it resembled a doorway. He chuckled, softly, nervously, ironically. Of course it did. Of course his mind would see symbols in everything now. Shadowy shapes, half-meaningful metaphors, psychological constellations connecting themselves, whether invited or not. He closed the journal, looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted lazily. Light moved slowly across the courtyard floor. A monk sang somewhere in the distance, slightly off-key, profoundly human. The priest whispered, I think I'm afraid to go back to who I was." The wind rustled the fig leaves. It wasn't a response. It wasn't comfort. But it was company. He sighed. "Or perhaps," he added, "I'm afraid I already can't." He stood, walked back toward the monastery halls. Each step felt deliberate, heavy, not with dread, but with awareness, like someone carrying a bowl of water, careful not to spill whatever fragile thing sloshed inside. As he reached the entrance to his chamber, he hesitated again. On the wooden door, barely visible in the morning light, was a faint mark, a smudge of ash, or dust, or shadow, shaped like a fingertip. He leaned closer, pressed his own finger against it. It fit, perfectly. He inhaled sharply. A warmth bloomed in his chest, a warmth that felt like recognition, or warning, or reassurance, or madness. He whispered, "You didn't leave, did you?" The silence remained still, but it was not empty. It was full, weighted, listening. He smiled, slowly, uncertainly, tenderly. "I see," he whispered. "So this isn't over." A breeze slipped through the hallway. Soft, brief, almost laughing. He stepped inside his chamber, closing the door gently behind him, leaving the question, the shadow, the presence, hanging in the air like incense smoke that refuses to rise. And the story? Oh, it did not end. Stories like this never end. They stretch into future nights, future silences, future questions, because perhaps God was busy, perhaps truth was shy, or perhaps, and this seemed increasingly likely, the universe was avoiding messages, the way most sensible beings avoid responsibilities on a Monday morning. Either way, nothing was resolved, and everything had begun. Night returned slowly, the way a shy guest returns to a gathering after pretending they had left for good. Its blue-black veil crept over the monastery walls, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The courtyard dimmed. Torches flickered awake with tiny gasps of flame. The air cooled, settling into that familiar medieval scent. Damp stone, old wood, unresolved prayer. The priest stood by his chamber window, candle unlit, watching the darkness roll in. He didn't tremble this time. No breath caught in his chest. No terror twisted in his gut. No frantic prayer attempted to escape his lips. He just watched the shadows gather softly around the corners of the monastery, stretching themselves like cats, patient, fluid, ancient. He whispered, "You again." And the darkness, if such a thing could respond, seemed to lean in with a subtle warmth, not comforting exactly, not threatening either, something between acknowledgement and amusement. He closed his eyes. For a moment he felt the quiet hum he had sensed before, the low pulse of something present, listening without needing to speak. It reminded him of last night's whisper. "You listen now." He did. Oh, he listened. He sat at his desk, opened his journal, touched the page with a reverence he had never shown Scripture. Tonight, no metaphors spilled out, no poetic crises, no symbols demanding interpretation. Only one sentence came: "I am not afraid of the darkness tonight." He stared at the words. They felt too simple, too innocent, too honest. He whispered, "Not afraid, but not certain either." And perhaps that was the point. He placed the quill down, extinguishing the thought before it grew too tidy. Certainty, he now understood, was a luxury people invented to soothe themselves. The universe was not interested in certainty. The divine was not interested in clarity. The darkness was not interested in answers, only in presence, only in attention, only in being. He stood again, drawn toward the window. The sky above was a deep, luxurious black. Ink poured across creation. A few stars glimmered timidly through drifting clouds. Somewhere in the distance, an owl sang a melancholy hymn that sounded like it, too, had recently discovered existential dread. He smiled. "I know you're there," he whispered to the night. Not because he saw anything, not because he heard anything, but because now, when the darkness settled, he felt a familiar quietness within himself, a quietness that wasn't emptiness, but company. He reached out a hand into the air beside the window, letting the cold wind pass through his fingers. It felt like nothing. It felt like everything. He whispered, "Will you speak again?" The silence held him gently, a silence that was no longer void, but presence, a silence that could have been a yes, or a no, or something more interesting. He let his hand fall. "Fine," he murmured. "Be mysterious. It seems to be your specialty." The wind brushed against the shutters in what could only be described as a quietly offended rustle. He chuckled, a soft, low, human sound. He sat on his bed, candle still unlit, letting the room fill with the raw, unfiltered shape of darkness. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to explain it, didn't try to resist it, didn't try to purify it with prayer. He simply allowed it to exist, allowed himself to exist inside it. And in that small, sacred moment, he realized something beautifully inconvenient. He had spent years terrified of the dark, terrified of what it hid, terrified of what it meant, terrified of what his mind might invent inside it. But the darkness itself, the darkness had never tried to harm him. It had only tried to be seen. And now it was. A single candle sat on the table, wick untouched. He reached for a match, paused, put it down. Instead, he whispered into the unbroken night, "Stay." The darkness did. Nothing shimmered, nothing shifted, nothing whispered. It just stayed, patient, silent, warm in its own strange, ancient way. He lay down, closing his eyes. The darkness wrapped around him softly, like a blanket woven from the absence of fear. Not a guardian, not a god, not a revelation, just a presence. His breath slowed, his mind eased, his heartbeat steadied. Outside, the wind moved gently across the monastery walls. Inside, the shadows curled into the corners like faithful companions. And before sleep carried him into whatever dreams awaited, he whispered one final, grateful sentence. "Thank you for finding me." The darkness, in its eternal irony, offered no verbal reply, but the candle never needed to be lit, and that was answer enough. A final image fills the room, a lone priest resting, a silent chamber holding him tenderly, a soft blackness breathing around him, and a candle unlit, its wick intact, its flame unnecessary. The world sleeps, faith wanders, shadows listen, and the night, patient as always, keeps its secrets.